Good afternoon. Welcome to the event of today, Circolo Gianicolense. Circolo Gianicolense is a network for scholars in the Gianicolo area of Rome, open to all international scholars. And the seminars are coordinated by the Norwegian Institute and the Institutum Romanum Finlandiae. And this seminar is the first of this spring term. And we are very happy to be able to present the Amos Anderson Fellow for 2020 at Institutum Romanum Finlandiae, Frederick Whitling. And the Amos Anderson Fellowship is founded by Föreningen Konstsamfundet, a private Finnish foundation in cooperation with Institutum Romanum Finlandiae. And the scholarship is named after Amos Anderson, the founder of Föreningen Konstsamfundet, whose support was also crucial to the founding of the Finnish Institute in Rome and the acquisition of Villa Lante. And the Amos Anderson Fellow for 2020 at Institutum Romanum Finlandiae, Frederick Whitling, has a PhD from 2010 at the European University Institute in Florence, and he has previously studied classical archaeology and ancient history at the University of Lund. He has specialized in archival research, studies of collections, and he has conducted his research projects in numerous archives and institutes in Italy, Greece, Germany, and Sweden during the years. In 2014, he edited the conference volume Svensk antikforskning vid Medelhavet, Gustaf VI Adolf och fältarkeologi i historiskt perspektiv. And in 2015, he revised and updated the manuscript of Erland Billing and Ragnhild Billing, Dies Academicus, the history of Swedish Institute at Rome, Svenska Institutet i Rom, from 1925 to 1950. And just for a year ago, 2019, Frederick Whitling published a monograph, Western Ways, Foreign Schools in Rome and Athens. The book sheds light on the scholarly organization of foreign schools and through them on the organization of classical archaeology and classical studies around the Mediterranean, and gives new perspectives on funding, national prestige, and international collaboration, and places the foreign schools in a framework of 19th and 20th century Italian and Greek history. And Frederick Whitling's historical research concerning Rome examines also the geographical cultural heritage of the Termini station. And here at the Institutum Romanum Finlandiae, Frederick Whitling's research project focuses on King Gustaf VI Adolf of Sweden as an archaeologist and cultural patron. Gustaf VI Adolf supported archaeological fieldwork and ensured their economic, scientific, and diplomatic prerequisites, and participated himself in excavations in several countries. Gustaf VI Adolf was also cultural patron, collector, and donator with various interests. And Frederick Whitling's research gives an extensive picture of the king's archaeological interest. And we are very happy today to hear more about King Gustaf VI Adolf of Sweden as archaeologist, chairman, and patron of the arts. And before Frederick will start, I will suggest that you can already, during his presentation, write your questions in the chat, so that we will have a discussion afterwards, after Frederick's presentation, and I hope for a very lively discussion afterwards. So please, Frederick.
Thank you very much, Arja. Thank you for this very nice introduction. You gave a very succinct and excellent overview of what the project is about. I'm just going to try to share my screen, and then I can actually start my presentation. Right, hopefully this works. Thank you again. Thank you to the Finnish Institute for this possibility. And also, it is a pleasure to present this in the context of the Circolo Gianicolense, a context on the Gianicolo Hill that I have myself attended a number of years ago, physically, in person. And it's a joy to see so many people wanting to attend this event, which gives me a wonderful opportunity to try to present an overview of this rather vast research project of mine on the key coordinating role of King Gustaf VI Adolf of Sweden for the organization of the study of the past, essentially in Sweden and elsewhere. I hope to finish processing the extensive archival material for this project in the foreseeable future, which is a relative concept perhaps these days. And its results depend partly on delimitation and thematic focus. Suffice to say that I hope to produce various material on aspects of this theme quite soon, hopefully. The project is presently at a rather interesting stage, as it were, of its development. And this presentation is an attempt to try to give an overview of an essentially vast topic, as I say, with selected examples of the diverse material and also a number of images to give you something nice to look at. But not only that, also I think the images themselves speak louder than many words in some cases. As Arja has already mentioned, I defended my PhD thesis in history, a thesis on foreign schools in Rome and classical archaeology in historical perspective at the European University Institute in Florence in 2010. And as has already been mentioned, revised parts of this material were published 2 years ago in a volume entitled Western Ways, Foreign Schools in Rome and Athens. Since 2011 or 12, depending on how you look at it, I've been working on this present project of mine on Gustaf Adolf, as I will be calling him, as archaeologist and patron of the arts. There we go. A portrait here of the king from 1967-68 in the context of one of two exhibitions on the Etruscans at the Historical Museum in Stockholm from 1967. The project itself treats the coordinating key role, as I say, of Gustaf Adolf for the organization of the study of the past during especially his very long period, relatively speaking, as Crown Prince, as heir to the throne, from 1907 to 1950. 43 years, which is essentially his active professional life was as Crown Prince, let's say. And this is an important aspect of this, because as Crown Prince, he was essentially free to take on, in this case, the chairmanship of a number of associations, which would have been impossible as king, let's say, and I will get back to this. And this period, 1907 to 1950, is historically interesting as it covers a period of expansion, let's say, of scientific pursuits from a Swedish, but also in an international perspective. It covers, for example, the vast archaeological undertaking at Accession in Greece in the 1920s. It covers the Swedish Cypress expedition, 1927 to 31. And it covers the establishment of various research institutes in Rome and in Athens, above all. All of this has had consequences, very clear consequences for the creation of museum collections in Sweden, consequences that are very visible also today in various museums, above all in Stockholm. Gustaf Adolf was 25 years old when he became the Crown Prince of Sweden in 1907, 2 years after the union between Sweden and Norway had been dissolved, incidentally. And he had, when he became king in 1950, he had already passed retirement age. He was in 68, which is, I think, quite a significant aspect here to keep in mind. And as a kind of figurehead of science, if you like, the Crown Prince became the obvious spider in the web, the central figure in a very vast network of mainly male academics, archaeologists, art historians and historians, but also businessmen, industrialists, people with money, and other patrons of the arts and collectors. Here we see a stamp from Sweden, 1962, for the King's 80th birthday, which covers some aspects of the very vast range of topics that the King was involved in. For example, education, museums, history, antiquities, philosophy, arts, music, etc. Interestingly, it doesn't mention archaeology, which is perhaps the most obvious one of them all. But that which will hopefully become clear from this presentation. My project departs from, and this is what struck me when I came across archival material which was previously inaccessible in the Royal Archives in Stockholm, this role as chairman. And I've been thinking a lot about this the last few years. What is a chairman of a board, as it were? What functions can be said to be encapsulated in this role, as it were? So the role of the Crown Prince as chairman in a large number of parallel, and this is also important, these things occur at the same time, parallel boards for committees, expeditions, and not least research institutes. And as the central figure in these networks, which enabled the support, the money, but also the diplomatic connections and the scientific connections for archaeological fieldwork in Sweden and around the world. He was a chairman of the board of the research institutes, the Swedish institutes in Rome and in Athens. He was the chairman of various committees and expeditions, such as the China Committee, the Accession Committee, the Egypt Committee, the Cypress Expedition, as well as associations and various, associations, let's say, such as, for example, the Swedish Orient Society, which I'll get back to, and the Friends of Nationalmuseum in Stockholm. So far, this project, which, as you probably can already tell, is quite vast, has resulted in a number of publications. And a study on the actual figure himself, the private individual, would be welcomed, definitely, and will presumably eventually appear. But a traditional biography as such will have to wait until after 2035, which is, after all, in a couple of years, when the private parts of the Royal Archives will become accessible to research. So far, the rather vast public parts of this archive are available. A few years ago, I had the pleasure of improvising a little exhibition at the Swedish Institute in Rome on the archaeological presence of the King. This was the sort of cover of this exhibition. One can ask oneself then, what was in it for him? What motivated this very strong engagement or engagements in the establishments of, for example, research institutes abroad and museum institutions in Sweden? And there are obviously various answers to that question, and I'll hope to cover some of those in this presentation. And the presentation itself and the project is largely based on, as I've already hinted at, unpublished archival material from a large number of different institutional as well as private sources. It's a near global project, which is quite an undertaking in cultural historical scope, and covers several diverse geographical contexts, mainly Sweden, Greece, Italy, Cyprus, Egypt, Turkey, and China. His lifelong interest in the humanities specifically, and well, particularly archaeology, arts, and crafts, contributed to his general popularity, at least in Sweden. the image of the king that dug, the king that was excavating, dressed up in a beret and in +4 trousers with various archaeological equipment in the Etruscan landscape, is, or was at least, a rather strong image for many people in Sweden and possibly also abroad. And to him, essentially, this interest, which made him a rather accessible public figure, and a very popular one, as I say, was much larger than some sort of royal hobby. It would be easy to somehow describe this as an extracurricular, nice, even strategic activity to be doing that looks good. But to him, it was much deeper than that. It was a genuine interest in history, and obviously he was born into this role of his. Otherwise, it's an open question what he would have done with these interests in academic competition, as it were. He had a scientific gaze for sure, and he became a specialist, a connoisseur, and an internationally accredited expert. And the thing that made this possible, essentially, was a combination of partly his personality and his personal interest, but also this, as I already said, this long period as crown prince, this flexibility, this let's say professional identity of his during almost half of his life. But I would venture to say that the general knowledge of this image of the king in the Etruscan landscape, etc., the interest in the king as archaeologist and patron of the arts is on the wane today. It's not as strong as it used to be, and I think it is to some extent generation-based, which is quite obvious. Interestingly, this happens at more or less the same occasion as various centenaries that are just about to happen for these various undertakings that he was involved in. So, going back to the very beginning, as it were, I believe this is the earliest photograph of this individual, as at the tender age of about 1 in 1883. This is a photograph with the young prince and his mother, the Crown Princess Victoria, and grandmother in Germany, in Karlsruhe. His mother, then Crown Princess Victoria, had undertaken study trips to Egypt in the 1890s, which is not insignificant here at all, and had very likely had quite some influence on the young prince. Her trips resulted in a large collection of photographs, some aquarelles, and a published travel account in German called Vom Nil. Also, a lot of objects that were, as it were, picked up in Egypt laid the foundation for the still active Victoria Museet in Uppsala. Here we see a portrait that has unfortunately gone missing or possibly been destroyed. It no longer exists. A portrait by the very well-known Swedish artist Anders Zorn of the 2 young princes, Gustaf Adolf and his brother Wilhelm. This is a rather poor reproduction of a photograph, as I say, of a painting that no longer exists. This is a better photograph of the 2 princes and the 3rd brother, Eric, at a young age. Gustaf Adolf's interest developed largely from botany to archaeology and antiquity via geology and collecting fossils, which is quite, there are detailed accounts of this. His first archaeological experience occurred as a teenaged prince, heir to the throne, in an excavation close to one of the royal palaces where they used to spend the summers in 1897. His first visit to this country, where I am, at least at the moment, in Italy, occurred in 1901. Through his studies in so-called Svensk fornkunskap, however you translate that, Swedish ancient history, as it were, Nordic archaeology, essentially, in Uppsala, at Uppsala University, the prince, together with his professor, Oskar Almgren, initiated the excavation of the so-called Håga Hög, a Bronze Age mound close to Uppsala in the same period, and lo and behold, came across absolutely glorious treasures, and now displayed in the Historical Museum in Stockholm as a result. He also started publishing. In 1903, he published an essay on archaeological discoveries in the vicinity of Norrköping in Sweden. In 1905, he visited Greece and Egypt on a study trip, when he also met his future wife, Margaret. Of course, the conditions for access to archaeology and art collections were unique for a figure of his standing. Basically, as a teenager, you don't get permission to excavate a Bronze Age mound on your own with your professor and then take all the finds back to your apartment in Uppsala, which is basically what happened. Obviously, the royal privilege here is a factor in this equation. It would be, anything else would be, of course, a surprise. But it's hard to even, I've been trying to recreate the status of royalty at this time, which was definitely different compared to today. He was an extremely elevated figure. Rushing through this for reasons of time, obviously, but this is what happens when you try to give an overview of something. His wife, or the already mentioned Margareta, sadly passed away. She died at a young age of 38, expecting their 6th child in 1920. And I mentioned this, and here is a letter of condolences, or a thank you note rather, for condolences signed by the Crown Prince. I mentioned this as I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this event, the fact that his wife suddenly died, changed things for him. Obviously, it changed things for him on a personal level, and he was left as a single father of 5 children, and also as heir to the throne, and he had to immediately start thinking about remarrying, which he also did. But before this, there is no archaeological chairmanship before 1920. In 1920, 21, 22, etc., they all start popping up like, well, they start popping up basically. And I think it's fair to say that without speculating too wildly, I think as partly the time was perhaps right, the children had grown up a bit. Also, it gave him something else to deal with, to engage himself in these archaeological interests of his, to take his mind off this rather tragic situation that he was in, a very difficult period. The next image here is of a monument in Helsingborg in southern Sweden, dedicated to the young princess. Next image, Louise, his future wife. They married in 1923, future Queen Louise of Sweden. This is her during the First World War. So 1920 is a very significant year in this context, and it basically it marks the beginning of 3 decades of active chairmanships for Gustaf Adolf. He engaged himself with great passion in these projects, and for him it was a period of discoveries, of excitement to some extent, and also, I think for him, a way of trying to combine these various interests from a position, a very unique position of overview, which I'll get back to. An image here of the so-called China Committee, but it's a good image of a board meeting. This is a painting from 1926, which can perhaps it can act as a sort of, it's a fitting background to what I'm about to say about these various engagements. Jumping back slightly, putting this in context, around the turn of the last century, many scholars and explorers in the West started taking, well, partly for reasons of travel and possibilities, started taking an interest in global perspectives comparative perspectives, relativizing historical and prehistorical cultures. Explorations and expeditions were commonly available, as it were, and occurred increasingly. Also, of course, as an aspect of colonizing the rest of the world from a Western perspective. From a Swedish and also international perspective, the sometimes controversial explorer Sven Hedin and his expeditions in Central Asia were of great significance. The white spots on the map literally were to be explored and documented, often obviously from a Western perspective, but with a very strong scientific and archaeological component. And this is essentially the grand narrative, the context in which these expeditions occur. Featured in this image, standing up, the Swedish geologist and archaeologist Johan Gunnar Andersson was one of the driving forces in this China committee, which was founded in 1919. Gustaf Adolf took over the chairmanship in 1921, and having already developed an interest in Chinese archaeology and arts, he basically confirmed the profile of this committee through his own expertise and his own archaeological interests. This was also possible, which should be mentioned, because of the possibility to actually travel to China and the renewed interest in China that had occurred after the fall of the empire in 1911, which was also the same year as the Friends of Nationalmuseum that I already mentioned in Stockholm was founded. And it was founded by Gustaf Adolf, together with his friend Torsten Laurin. And this is an exception then to, as I mentioned, 1920 as being this big watershed year, which is true. 1911 Nationalmuseum provides another sort of prehistory, if you like, of this chairmanship tradition from his perspective. And so, going back to China, the Young Republic made it much more possible, easier for Westerners to travel in the great country, and also initiated a trend of great China exhibitions in Europe, Amsterdam, London, and so on. Also in Stockholm, organized by, guess who, Gustaf Adolf. The first one in 1914, focusing on pottery, was the largest that thus far had been arranged in Europe. 1921 then, 100 years ago, and literally, actually, exactly 100 years ago, in about a month from now, in March 1921, the Swedish Orient Society, Svenska Orientsällskapet, was founded with the archaeologist Ture Arne, who is depicted here as secretary and a driving force, and no prizes for guessing who the chairman was. Of course, Gustaf Adolf took this on. The timing was interesting, and the timing was right, I think, from his perspective. This can be understood, I think, in the context also of the China Committee, in the same spirit of trying to answer very grand questions and great research tasks with a very, very wide brush stroke, let's say, trying to, for example, trace the roots of Chinese culture to ancient Babylon, this sort of thing. So how do we connect the various parts of the world with each other? And how can we, this little group of people, why are we the people to do so? The Swedish Orient Society is still active. I'm personally involved in the coming Jubilee volume, which we will look forward to. The following year, 1922, which was also the sort of poster image of this event, the large-scale Swedish archaeological undertaking at Accession in Greece was initiated. This took place, which is very much connected, actually, is very specifically connected with the death, I think, of his first wife, Margareta. He needed to get away in 1920. In the autumn, he went with his uncle, Prince Eugen, to Greece. And in Greece, he met with a number of various academics and essentially secured the archaeological permit via Axel V. Persson, who I'll return to, for a Swedish excavation in Greece. the first one of its kind since the first Swedish excavation in Greece, which took place in 1894. This undertaking would be a massive thing and would basically go on for the rest of that decade. Here we see the Crown Prince in action in 1922 at Athens. He was there for about 7 weeks. It wasn't just a case of turning up and having a few snapshots taken and then leaving again. He was there essentially he was there in the morning. He left in the afternoon, as it were. Took part with great enthusiasm. Here's another image of the group of excavators at Athens in 1922. One of them is Einar Gjerstad, to whom I will return, and another is Axel Persson, the short guy in the middle, in the tropical hat. And here's another image from the excavations in 1922. Interestingly, however, having just mentioned the Swedish Orient Society, there was a slight conflict of interest here in these tight-knit circles involved, which can be discerned. Basically, Sweden was not the largest and still isn't the largest country in the world, and one could only afford one thing at a time. There was a conflict in that sense already from the beginning between the Athena Committee and the Orient Society. Why? Partly because the Orient Society was keen to and also did establish an institute in Constantinople. So from 1922 to 1924, a brief spell of activity, there was such a thing as a Swedish institute in Constantinople, which closed down. There is now a Swedish Institute in Istanbul, which was established in the 1960s, but that's a different story. But there's essentially this conflict of interest and funding, and also where to focus on, which is built into the whole idea of if the Orient Society was Orientalist, the Athena excavation was classical archaeology and, as it were, classicist. And there is an interesting tension here as to what part of the world to focus on, what part of the Mediterranean to focus on. And had things gone differently, there might have been a Swedish institute in Athens instead in this period. But there we have it. But I find it a rather good example of how you need a network of people to establish anything. But if there's a conflict of interest within this network, you build in a bit of tension, so to speak. Johan Gunnar Andersson, who I already mentioned, in the China Committee, had returned to Sweden and to Stockholm in the mid-20s. And in 1926, he returned to China to acquire material for a new museum, so-called Östasiatiska samlingarna in Stockholm, which became the East Asia Museum eventually. The same year, 1926, which was also when the Swedish Institute in Rome initiated its activities, the Crown Prince and his wife Louise embarked on a world tour, essentially, an almost year-long trip around the world, starting in America and then continuing, of course, with China on the agenda, on the program. He had studied Chinese art since his youth, and for the first time, he got the chance to actually see this country with which he was so enthralled. I mentioned the Swedish Institute in Rome, which was founded in 1925 and initiated its activities in 26. And this came out of this tension that I essentially just hinted at between Constantinople and Athens. If they hadn't bickered so much about where to establish that, they might have basically agreed on something. Instead, the outcome became the Swedish Institute in Rome for various reasons, mainly two. It was more accessible, it was easier to get to Italy, and the Vatican archives. And this was a rather sensible assessment, one could argue. Here we have images of Gustaf Adolf visiting the Institute in Rome, or visiting Rome in 1927, basically returning from his worldwide trip. That year, as I mentioned this because this is an aspect of this project that has come out essentially stronger and stronger over the years here, funding. In 1927, Gustaf Adolf contributed very strongly to establishing the so-called Humanistiska Fonden in Sweden, of which he also became the chairman, which was a precursor to the Swedish Research Council of today, Vetenskapsrådet. This fund was established basically using state so-called lottery fund and was run by the Swedish the Royal Academy of Letters. 1927 was also the year of the large-scale Swedish Cypress expedition, the year that took off. One could talk for a long time about that. I will not do that now, but suffice to say that the excavations at Accession that had started in 1922 was a sort of school for some of these archaeologists who then took part in this expedition. For example, Einar Gjerstad, the leader of the expedition, whom you see here in various photographs. You also see Erik Sjökvist, for example, eventually the director of the Swedish Institute in Rome, and others. Moving on, this is Gustaf Adolf in 1928. He was right in the middle then of this rather interesting multiple chairmanship period. All these various activities were going on at the same time. Meetings would take place at the same day. 1 o'clock, Cyprus expedition, 2 o'clock, Accession meeting, etc. At his place, at the Royal Palace. This is a rather unique situation. In 1929, he's depicted here receiving the so-called Winkelmann medal, which he received together with the city of Rome, which is quite a grand thing. The first time, this was the German Archaeological Institute celebrating its centenary. This is Gerhard Rodenwald, the responsible from the DAE, handing over this medal. Gustaf Adolf was the first recipient of this. And this, of course, the Archaeological Institute wouldn't give to anyone off the street. They gave it to the archaeologist, Gustaf Adolf, but also, of course, his royal patronage and so on. It is quite a remarkable thing, therefore it deserves mention. I'll move through this as fast as I can, chronologically. In 1930, here's an image from travels to Egypt. This is relevant from many perspectives, of course, but also as Gustaf Adolf was the chairman of the so-called Egypt Committee, which was founded 2 years before that in Stockholm, with excavations and eventually, and also at the same time, the Egyptian Museum, which eventually became part of the so-called Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm. A rare image of relaxation at lunch in Italy in 1933, together with the close friends Ferdinand and Anna Boberg, in giving an image of a more private aspect, which doesn't come through very much, perhaps, in the rest of this presentation. A very significant thing in terms of archaeological organization and, well, it's also in terms of diplomacy, occurred through the so-called Orient travel, Orient trip, Orientresa, a couple of months from 1934 to 1935. Starting in Athens, you see the Crown Prince at Syntagma Square in Athens. You see him together with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and you see him relaxing on the Atatürk's personal train en route to Syria. Traveling around and coming into contact with authorities also in Turkey, which essentially set up the rather well-known possibilities for the so-called Labranda expedition after the Second World War. During the last 5 years as Crown Prince, from 1945 to 50, Gustaf Adolf was also chairman, Preses, of the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters, History and Antiquities, which is, again, something you can only be that if you are a scholar, as it were. It wasn't because of his royal status. There is no other royal figure that has had that position, let's say. So the very, by then, extremely experienced chairman, there was arguably no more experienced chairman of anything, took over also this. In 1946, the Swedish Institute at Athens was, as it were, finally established in Sweden. It was inaugurated 2 years later and connected very much, as you get a hint at least here, to the Swedish Red Cross activities in Greece during the Second World War, which had created a lot of goodwill for Sweden. And Axel Persson, who you see here on this bust, who you last saw in a photograph of Massina in 1922, was instrumental in establishing this institute. An image then from the apartment, his personal apartment, the Royal Palace in Sweden, where all these board meetings actually took place. This apartment does no longer exist. It doesn't exist in this form, let's say. In almost all of these cases, Gustaf Adolf would remain as chairman until he became king in late 1950. When all of these active chairmanships were at once in a flash, where he had to give them up. It wouldn't be formally acceptable. However, he remained in nearly all cases as honorary chairman until his dying breath, essentially, and was kept à jour with business on an absurd level of detail for the rest of his life, suffice to say. Adding to the personal tragedy element of his, he got his fair share, one has to say. Not only did his wife die, also his eldest son, and the future heir to the throne, the eponymous Gustaf Adolf, as he was called, died in a plane crash in 1947, which of course changed a lot of things for the royal family, for him personally, and it became an interesting equation. And as you probably know, the present king of Sweden was born the year before, and essentially the whole equation was based on Gustaf Adolf remaining alive long enough so that the present king could become of age, as it were, to formally inherit the throne. So moving towards the end of this eventually here, I would like to say a few words about his patron of the arts aspect of collecting, museum collections. To him, archaeology and collecting were sides of the same coin. And as I already mentioned, Gustaf Adolf took an early interest in Chinese arts. He acquired his first Chinese art object as early as 1907. His collecting activities had been influenced definitely by his uncle, Prince Eugen, who I already mentioned, and others. But he arguably took the tradition of royal collecting much further than is commonly known, and became a world-leading expert on Chinese antiquities, for example. One of his close associates, Bo Gyllensvärd, in 1971, stated that collecting was to him always, to the king, was always more about acquiring knowledge than acquiring objects, let's say. And essentially this collecting activity followed two parallel tracks, one private and one public. And the public aspect, which I find rather interesting, was his total understanding of what was lacking in Swedish museum collections. On these various travels that I've already mentioned, like in Egypt, in Turkey, and during his Orient travels, during his worldwide tour, he would habitually purchase things that he knew would fit in, for example, the collections of Nationalmuseum or what would become the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm. For example, the so-called comparative collection at Historiska Museet, the Historical Museum in Stockholm, is full of various donations from Gustaf Adolf over a long period of time. An image here from an exhibition that took place in 1940, I believe, in Stockholm, a family tree of Swedish excavations on classical ground, as it proudly boasts, which gives quite a pedagogical illustration of where the Swedes were most active, perhaps. Greece and Cyprus, for sure. There's also a little Italian tree, a little Egyptian tree, and a little Iranian twig, as it were. Without being able to go into detail about too much detail here, I mentioned this was in a context of an exhibition on the Cypress Collections. The Cypress Collections, of course, being a result of the Cyprus expedition. They were merged together with the Egyptian Museum and parts of the Assine collections into, and also part of the Nationalmuseum collections, into what became the Mediterranean Museum in Stockholm, Medelhavsmuseet. This was founded in 1954. After becoming king then, this image that I mentioned in the beginning, that some Swedes, at least of a certain generation, would be familiar with, of the old king in, as it were, on all fours in the Etruscan landscape, this is, of course, intimately linked with the excavations of the Swedish Institute in Rome, first at this place called San Giovanale, and then at Aquarossa in Etruria, undertakings that basically followed on each other, and they were initiated in 1956 with a very strong involvement of the king. And the Swedish Institute in Rome, above all, because of the situation of being able to purchase things on the Italian antiquities market, became a base, essentially, a point of reference for the king's own collecting. Also, in order to buy things for the Mediterranean Museum, as I mentioned. Here is an image of the Crown Prince still in 1949, visiting excavations on the Forum Romanum, together with Einar Gjerstad, and also Gjerstad's successor as director of the Institute in Rome, Erik Sjöqvist, later excavated at Morgantina on Sicily. Here's an image of the two of them from the mid-50s. So this idea of filling the gaps of museum collections certainly didn't decrease when he became king. On the contrary, really, with regular visits, to, for example, to London and the antiquities market there. But this yearly possibility to purchase things in Italy occurred in the Swedish Institute in Rome excavations in Etruria every autumn, starting 1956. And here we have another image, actually, from Sweden, but it's a good picture, so I thought I might include it, from excavations on Öland. In the Accession catalogue of the Mediterranean Museum, you find regular notes, essentially, information of the accession regarding various objects, and it's very common that you simply find gift from His Majesty the King bought in Rome. That's basically what you get, but it's the recurrence is quite striking. One of the places in Rome that was heavily used by Gustaf Adolf was the antique stele Falani, which I believe is still possibly in existence. Through his personality, through his authority, through his experience, he could guarantee also exchanges of object groups from abroad for exhibitions and so on. And these acquisitions were performed regularly, as I say. They were, however, not limited to his regular annual visits to Italy. For example, the librarian and basically jack of all trades of the Swedish Institute, Gino Filippetto, who was also involved in the practicalities of the purchase of the Villa Lante, where we are at the moment here in the early 1950s. He was a very willing, let's say, go-between in these antiquities purchases in Rome, with the Swedish Institute as a sort of backup. But the Swedish Institute also became, in that sense, very intimately connected to the Mediterranean Museum, and sort of vice versa. So this here is an image from the King's own excavation diary from San Giovanale from 1961. His camera that he used, which was donated to the Swedish Institute, and his trowel from the excavations in Etruria. And I'll fire off a few pictures here just to give you some idea of these annual autumnal excavation visits to Italy. together with Axel Boetius here, the first director of the Swedish Institute, together with Gino Filippetto there, which on the to the left at a press conference, lunch images, various group photographs from the Etruscan landscape, an image of the king together with his granddaughter, Queen Margareta of Denmark, then princess, who took part in excavations in Etruria, but also, interestingly, in Nubia, which is another context which is of much interest, which I don't really have time to go into here. A color image, a late image of the king excavating, presumably at Aquarossa. And this, of course, became this image that was popularized, was all over the press at the time, in Italy, Sweden, and elsewhere. Il re archeologo, the archaeological king, the king archaeologist. His last image is from the Swedish Institute in Rome in 1962, from the only radio interview that the king ever gave, which was recorded, interviewed by Sven Jerring, the rather legendary radio man in Sweden, which is an interesting document in itself. So wrapping this up, an image of the king, a rather late image from about 1970, visiting an exhibition, presumably in Stockholm. When the king died in 1973, it was suddenly made very clear to what extent he had also, after his life, continued to support these enterprises that he had actively founded or contributed to found through an enormous will, a gift for his will. Gustaf VI Adolf's testamentariska gåva in Swedish. One of the many recipients of this very generous donation was Medelhavsmuseet, the Mediterranean Museum. For example, objects that could only have ended up in his hands. There were an Etruscan Hellenistic votive head in terracotta given by the Pope, Paul VI, the state visit, and another amphora, an Etruscan amphora given by the President of Italy, Giuseppe Saragat. Things like that ended up in the Mediterranean collection via him, but of course many other objects as well. And the massive Chinese collection, his own personal collection, was donated at the same time, almost in its entirety, to the East Asia Museum. So it's difficult to sum this up, of course, and I hope to have given at least an idea of the crucial influence of this man in many of these undertakings in Swedish research and cultural life during his long period as Crown Prince, which is less known, I would say, than those more public images of him, his activities as king, but at least as important, if not even more so. The chairmanship of these institutions is essentially the takeaway thing, I think, from this presentation, possibly, or at least one of the things. And to me, it provides an excellent opportunity to study the role of individuals and the challenge of dealing with how do you study individual agency and the pitfalls, perhaps, the risks of overemphasizing one person. Quite aware of that, and those risks are, of course, very clear in this particular case. On the other hand, you know, there are various aspects. We could discuss that perhaps after the presentation here. So I wanted to illustrate this multitasking, coordinating role, this node, if you like, in this Swedish context. And of course, as I say, many doors opened for him that would have been utterly impossible to even budge by anyone else. But there was also a price to pay for this royal role. It was impossible for him to become a scientist, as it were, in a professional sense. So he was always, I think, for him, he had to struggle with that he was sort of referred to as, the king with an archaeological interest, whereas to him, he was as into these discussions as anyone else, let's say. Did he have any other, well, are there any precedents? Are there any other comparisons here in the Swedish context, for example, or as far as I'm concerned, anywhere else in the world? Not really, I think. Not in this sense, not in this long chairmanship period in terms of the status of Crown Prince, The obvious comparison in Sweden is Gustaf III in the 18th century as the culture king, as it were, but that would be a tenuous comparison at best, I would say. Finishing off, when he received one of his many honorary doctorates awarded to him in Oxford in 1955, in this case, he himself emphasized context, reasonable proportion, when he related his views on how small national perspectives on science, in this case archaeology and classical studies, could appear in an international comparative perspective. So the national perspective to him was never enough. You needed to collaborate in order to actually produce something of real value, as it were. And this required access to multiple viewpoints, to make use of personal connections, and a personal desire to cross scholarly and other boundaries between academic disciplines and other recently established traditions. Most of this seems to have been second nature to Gustaf Adolf. He was good at that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Frederick, for a fantastic historical resume for decades, the last century, and the development of royal archaeology, if we can say so. And we have already received some questions here, and we can start by the first comment of Christina Wistman concerning the king and Prince Eugen. Would you like to comment on that, Christina?
No, actually not. I was just sitting here thinking about my own research and also how Prince Eugene actually fought with his royal position too. He called himself only Eugene, and he also oh, and I'm losing the words. His art collection is also quite vast, for example, and now there is a public museum in it. But the most interesting, I think, that is his role as a field agent. And I can see that Gustaf Adolf too has the same way of moving over the field, actually.
Yes, thank you. That's and nice to, as it were, meet you. I'm aware of your important work on the Prince, and yeah, that's I've gone through. I've had the privilege of going through the correspondence in Prince Eugen's archives in Valdemarsudde, which is one of the few examples of actual personal perspectives that come out in. They were very open with each other, and it was a very strong link. And I think you can't emphasize enough the influence of his uncle in this case. But yes, as a field agent, I think these things can't really be separated. I think the art collecting aspect and the archaeological activities in this case were really sides of the coin for Gustaf Adolf. I don't think he would have seen that as two different things in a way. But yeah, I think they shared this obviously the status of royalty, but also chairmanship. I know Prince Eugen, for example, is chairman of the Birgitta Stiftelsen and so on in Sweden. And I can only say that he was extremely influential, and I think you are perfectly right. They shared this agency in the field, and to be able to perhaps they also shared a personal characteristic of being able to move to switch focus quite and to move freely between these contexts. I would say Eugen was more political.
Yeah, he really was. And I think that Gustaf Adolf became, understand me right now, but he became a better version of Eugen, and also a more educated version of him.
Yeah, how do you mean? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, I think that Eugen, he was standing more on the barricades, and he needed to do that in his time. But Gustaf Adolf, he could focus on other things, actually.
Yes. Also, I think the obvious difference is that Eugen knew very well that he wasn't very likely to ever become king, and he didn't have to worry about that. So with his own career as an artist, he wouldn't have been allowed to go to Paris, for example, if he'd been first in line, presumably, or maybe not at least. But yeah, it's interesting what you say about a better version. I suppose that's a matter of one could discuss that for some time.
Yeah, but Eugen also said, I think it was in a letter to Prince Wilhelm, that he hoped that he had been a role model in some ways to show them that they also could be what they wanted to be self, not only a royal person, but also a more common person.
Yes, one thing comes to mind that is very clear in one of the few letters that I have from Eugen to Gustaf Adolf. He does come across a little bit as the slave that whispers into the emperor's ear. There is an element of don't forget who you are, don't forget what you're doing, and don't get ahead of yourself. He speaks very directly to him, which I find interesting. Well, thank you for that.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I hope to discuss more.
Yeah, it would be fun.
Thank you, Christina. Christina, now we have a question that both Ingrid Berg and Anna Gustafsson want to discuss concerning the king's purchases and collections in connection with the contemporary legal frameworks in different countries. So that if you, Ingrid, wish to comment on that.
Sure. Thank you so much, Arja. And hi, Frederick, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. And hi, everyone. It's so good to see so many friends and colleagues I haven't seen in ages. So this is really fun. This is one of the good things I think about, distance and Zoom meetings. So it's really good to see you. Right. So I have a question, and it concerns whether you have any examples of where the king's agency as a king went against, contemporary legal frameworks of the country that he was collecting from. So do you have any examples of where you can clearly see that the king is breaking legal rules here in order to get excavation permits or collections or purchasing stuff? And is that something that is discussed in general when it comes to royal collecting in the research that you are doing at the moment? I don't know if that was your question too, Anna. Please fill in if you have.
Yes, more or less. Just curious about the if there are any documents, any way of finding out how these purchases could be done and so on. So yeah.
Or any controversies, were people opposed to the king's collecting at any point? Are there, people in Greece or Italy, protesting this practice that the king is doing? So that's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Nice to see you. Yeah, it's very good questions. I'll answer them as I'll give you something at least diplomatically as I can. Without, but it's obviously a very important aspect of this, and the regulations I would say in terms of the archaeological permits, on the contrary, following on almost on a daily basis when it comes to Greece is interesting in the 1920s when it all tightens up during the various political developments, the monarchy, the republic, and so on, and suddenly the archaeological legislation stuff. And on one, I'll say that, and then I'll say something about the actual breaking the rules. But it's interesting because the whole Athene project was obviously scientifically unquestionable in many ways, and so on. But on a personal level, I think a disappointment. The idea was to excavate the place, take the stuff, bring it to Sweden, and make a museum out of it, essentially. And because of this legislation, this changed during the project. So in 1924, things changed. So it's and there was calamities wouldn't occur again. So that there is, and so legislation changes all the time. You don't really, as a chairman or as organizers of such a thing, deliberately break the law. No, I don't think so. You could argue, you know more than I do, the ins and outs of the Nubia situation, for example, in the 60s. UNESCO, in real time, when new projects occur, you know, you sort of make it up as you go along, in a way. But there are actually examples, and offhand I can't remember exactly which objects, but there are objects. This aspect of purchasing things in the antiques market in Rome in the 60s. There are a few cases of. There were even a few newspaper scandals, if you like, where the king was involved in affairs that didn't look very good. Let's say that things that weren't necessarily not legal, but that. Maybe the permits hadn't quite been secured by the time things were actually signed and so on. It's a matter of how you, in terms of if people were against, it's interesting, this controversy that I talked about earlier in terms of the conflict of interest in Sweden, how many things can you do at the same time? The Orient Society and versus the Asine Committee, for example. Lennart Kjellberg, your old favorite, he wasn't entirely pleased that the Crown Prince would come. There was a sort of Lund faction and an Uppsala faction, if you like, rooting for Athens in this case, or Constantinople. He came in. The Crown Prince came in with quite a big. He would take quite a lot of oxygen in the room, I would think, as it were. I don't know if that answers some of this, perhaps.
Yes, thank you so much. I hear you about the Lennart situation. Lennart did not like anyone sucking oxygen out of rooms. That was not his thing. And I just want to clarify one thing about the Nubia campaign. So there was a new legislation put in place just for the Nubia campaign where funds would be divided between the host country and the excavating countries. Yes. So they made a whole legislation around that with the UN. And Sudan and Egypt, just for that purpose. So,
yes. I mean, just to put it bluntly, he was not above the law. The Crown Prince wasn't.
No, well, that's good. Thank you so much, Frederick.
I can't hear you there, Arja.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we had a problem with the connection for a moment. So Ulla Rajala has a question concerning the funding. If the king guaranteed funding for excavations in Italy, directly or indirectly, funding for the excavations.
Well, yes. It's complicated, but yes, by the time these excavations in Italy, the ones you're referring to in the 50s and 60s took place, he was no longer active chairman. He was king. But on the other hand, which I didn't have time to go into, I mentioned Humanistiska Fonden in 1927. There was also the so-called Kungafonden, the royal fund, which was set up for his birthday, essentially his 70th birthday in 1952, and that proved to be extremely significant. I've gone through a lot of material recently, which is of interest there, and through basically handing out individual grants to archaeologists, to scholars, he definitely funded excavations personally, as it were, in Italy. Also by providing a scholarship for Swedish students to go to Sicily. This was an annual thing for many years, which was out of his own, as it were, the funds that he controlled himself. But of course, as chairman for many years, by simply securing state funding, for example, for the Swedish Institute in 1938, big deal, which all of that adds up. So it's regarding the actual excavations themselves, that's quite complicated. Funding from various sources, not least foundations. And by that time, as I say, he was influential, of course, but he was not active chairman of the board.
Yes, and we can, of course, add the comments. This comment also to Susan Dixon's question about the king's support archaeological education in Sweden and the training to become a professional archaeologist. Susan had a question on that, and there you already mentioned the Sicily scholarships for the student trips to Sicily. That's one form, but do you know more about that? His promoting of studies, archaeological studies.
Yes, as I say, this the material, the documentation of this Kungafond is the prime source material for this, and you can really. He was as much. He supported classical archaeology as much as Nordic archaeology, as it were, to some. I think it's fair to say. So. It depends on what level, really. I think there are more cases of more advanced studies of master students and so on, PhD candidates, publication support and so on, than actual students, apart from these scholarships that I mentioned. But yes, I think through the agency, through the Humanistiska Fonden and Kunga, other than that, of course, being chairman of the board, every time that he had quite some influence on which people got the various grants that were available, for example, at the Swedish Institute in Rome over the years, over the 25 years when he was an active chairman. And also his alma mater, Uppsala. He was an honorary doctorate at Lund. There were so many connections there, and but it depends on how you look at it, what level, how active the support was. He was in a sense a deus ex machina in many ways. His presence wasn't always entirely obvious, but he was there.
Definitely, as a chairman of all these boards, he was promoting Swedish archaeological studies and research forward. And do we have any more questions? There were comments concerning a couple of comments concerning the Swedish Cypress collections, and as you know that they are divided between Sweden and Cyprus, so that here we have several persons who might comment on that, but that's a long discussion, so that we maybe skip that. But do you have anything else you wish to comment on, so that we are really happy to have been able to hear all these wonderful details of Gustaf Adolf's activities and as an archaeologist, as a promoter of humanistic studies and classical studies in the Mediterranean and in Sweden.
Yeah, I noticed people are commenting on Cyprus. There is a lot to be said on that, but I think it's best not to do that right now.
Yes. And I would like to comment also on the importance of Gustaf VI Adolf also here in Italy, how well known he was, and that was so amazing to see the photos of the king visiting the museum, for example in Sperlonga, or for example when you visit the Archaeological Museum in Volterra, they have just beside the entrance there the important dates of the museum, where they mention when King Gustaf Adolf visited the museum, so that he has been very important person for archaeology and archaeologists here in Italy, definitely for all these decades and the activities, his activities during the years. We have also maybe Susanne Unge Sörling. Do you wish to comment something? We do not hear any comments, but
we lost you there, Arja, I'm afraid.
So I'm really happy that you have been so numerous during this event on a Friday afternoon, even. So that I once more I wish to thank Frederick for this wonderful presentation of his project as Amos Anderson Fellow at the Institute, Finnish Institute, and I thank you all and wish you a very nice weekend, buon weekend as we say here, and a nice start for the spring season.
Thank you.